Most men believe that power in attraction comes from always doing more. More effort, more attention, more explanations, more proof. That very belief is exactly what leads them to failure. Because the truth is uncomfortable, and once you see it, there's no going back. Attraction doesn't arise from what you give. It arises from what you don't need. Women aren't drawn to pressure. They're drawn to psychological tension. And that tension lives in places most men never look. Here's the raw reality. Every human being has emotional pressure points, not weaknesses in a cruel sense, but subconscious gaps around certainty, security, validation, and control. Women are no exception. The men who naturally dominate attraction dynamics aren't manipulative, loud, or aggressive. They simply understand where the emotional lever is, and they never chase it. That's why some men say almost nothing and remain unforgettable. That's why others step back and suddenly become irresistible. That's why silence, restraint, and calm unsettle more than any compliment ever could. This isn't about tricks, it's about psychological gravity. When you understand how the female mind protects itself and what cracks that protection, you stop reacting emotionally. You stop trying to impress. You stop negotiating desire. And that's when the dynamic flips. Most men lose their power because they reveal too much certainty. They explain their intentions, clarify their feelings, eliminate every mystery in the name of honesty, without seeing that mystery is the real engine of attraction. What women respond to isn't cruelty, it's emotional self-mastery. The instant she senses that your happiness, your confidence, and your direction don't depend on her reaction, something subtle shifts inside her. Curiosity replaces comfort. Interest replaces certainty. Respect replaces familiarity. And here's the part almost no one says out loud. The female mind is wired to test emotional strength, not consciously, but instinctively. Not to hurt, but to feel safe. If you collapse under pressure, over-explain, or seek reassurance, attraction quietly slips away. But if you stay anchored, calm, and selective, something pivots. She starts adjusting to you. On the channel Relationship Psychology, we don't talk about domination. We talk about mastery. Mastery of your reactions, your need to be chosen, the emotional reflexes that make you lose power without realizing it. Today, I'm going to walk you through 7 psychological vulnerabilities, not to exploit them, but to understand them. Because once you grasp them, you stop getting pulled into emotional games and start setting the frame. Most men never learn this. That's why they chase, overinvest, and lose attraction without knowing when it happened. Stay until the end. Once you see these patterns clearly, you'll never interact the same way again. The first vulnerability is the fear of emotional uncertainty. One of the deepest vulnerabilities in the female mind isn't insecurity, jealousy, or need, it's emotional uncertainty. Because certainty kills attraction faster than rejection ever could. When a woman knows exactly where she stands with you, exactly what you feel, exactly how far you'd go for her, her emotional system relaxes too quickly, and relaxed emotions don't desire, don't pursue, don't stay alert. That's where most men make their first fatal mistake. They believe clarity builds connection. In reality, premature clarity dissolves attention. Emotional uncertainty isn't chaos or manipulation. It's the quiet space where curiosity lives. It's the feeling of not fully knowing what you think, not knowing how much she's affected you, not knowing how much access she has to your inner world. When that uncertainty exists, her mind stays engaged even when you're not around. She replays conversations, analyzes your tone, searches for meaning in the details. Not because you asked her to, but because her subconscious needs resolution. Men who give too much certainty often do it without realizing. They over-explain intentions, reassure too quickly, erase every doubt in the name of honesty, without seeing that attraction feeds on unanswered questions. When you become predictable, you become emotionally flat, and flatness is comforting but forgettable. The advantage doesn't come from withholding affection or being cold. It comes from staying emotionally centered in yourself. When you don't rush to define the connection, when you let things unfold without labeling them prematurely, you send a powerful signal. Your emotional state is stable and doesn't depend on immediate validation. That creates a subtle imbalance, not of power, but of investment, because the one seeking clarity is always more emotionally invested than the one comfortable in the waiting. Women are naturally attuned to emotional shifts. When they sense you're calm in uncertainty, not anxious, not rushed, not afraid of losing the connection, something important happens inside. Their emotional radar activates. They start leaning, not physically at first, but psychologically, because the mind always moves before the body. That's why silence, pauses, and measured responses are so effective. They're not tactics, they're reflections of inner control. A man who can rest comfortably in uncertainty communicates strength without a single word. He doesn't need to secure interest. He trusts his own value. That trust is felt instinctively. Once a woman senses you aren't chasing emotional certainty, she starts seeking it from you. That's when the dynamic changes. Not because you demanded control, but because you never surrendered it. The second vulnerability is the need to feel chosen rather than pursued. One of the most misunderstood emotional drivers in women is the need to feel chosen rather than chased. Being pursued creates attention, but being chosen creates value. When a man pursues, he places himself in a position of seeking approval, even reluctantly, and that seeking is felt emotionally. It communicates that his worth is external, negotiable, dependent on her response. That imbalance tips the scales before any real connection even forms. Feeling chosen is different. It's realizing a man has standards, preferences, boundaries, and that her presence in his life is the result of alignment, not desperate effort. When a woman feels chosen, she doesn't feel hunted or pressured. She feels recognized, and recognition activates a deeper bond than pursuit ever could. Most men confuse effort with value. They believe doing more will make her appreciate them more. But appreciation doesn't come from excessive availability. It comes from selectivity. When you're selective, every action carries weight. When you're always available, your presence becomes expected rather than desired. The psychological vulnerability here isn't ego. It's identity. Women are highly sensitive to whether a man operates from abundance or scarcity. A man who operates from abundance doesn't rush, doesn't aggressively compete, doesn't seek constant validation. He observes, responds, leaves space for mutual discovery. That space creates contrast, and contrast is what the mind remembers. When a woman senses you're not trying to conquer her, but calmly evaluating whether she fits your world, something shifts inside. Her attention moves from being the prize to wondering if she's qualified. It's not a conscious calculation, it's an automatic emotional repositioning that happens when effort stops being one-sided. That's why men who pull back slightly after showing interest often create stronger attraction than those who stay constantly intense. Pulling back doesn't mean disappearing or turning cold. It means allowing her to feel the absence of your attention just enough to recognize its value. The mind always measures value through contrast, not consistency. A woman who feels chosen starts investing emotionally because investment confirms her own worth. She becomes more open, warmer, more curious, not from pressure, but because she wants to maintain the position she feels she's earned. The dynamic becomes reciprocal rather than transactional. That's also why compliments and validation are far more powerful when they're specific, moderate, and rare. When approval is given selectively, it's meaningful. When it's given freely, it loses impact. The goal isn't to withhold affection, it's to give it with intention. Men who understand this vulnerability don't chase love. They create the conditions where love feels like a choice, not a concession. And once a woman feels chosen rather than pursued, she stops testing your value and starts protecting the connection. The third vulnerability is the reactivity to masculine calm. One of the least discussed vulnerabilities in women is how powerfully they react to a man who remains emotionally calm under pressure, especially when emotion would normally be expected. Emotional calm isn't indifference or suppression, it's the visible absence of inner chaos. And that absence has a profound effect on the female nervous system. Most people automatically mirror emotions. Tension, they react. Uncertainty, they seek reassurance. Conflict, they explain or defend. A man who does none of that stands out immediately. He breaks the emotional pattern she unconsciously expects. That disruption triggers attention. Women are wired to read emotional signals quickly. When a man stays calm while others react, it sends a silent signal of strength, stability, and inner leadership. It's not analyzed logically, it's felt. Calm creates a sense of safety, but also mystery, because she can't predict your emotional moves. The vulnerability here is emotional contrast. When emotions rise and yours remain anchored, her nervous system adapts to yours rather than the other way around. That shift subtly places you in the position of emotional leader, not because you assert dominance, but because you refuse to be pulled into volatility. Leadership in attraction is always emotional before it's behavioral. Many men sabotage attraction by overreacting to the slightest emotional shift. They panic when she withdraws, get defensive in disagreements, rush to explain when they sense distance. Those reactions communicate emotional dependence, even when the intention is good. Dependence dissolves desire because no one desires what they feel responsible for. A man who stays calm when she tests, challenges, or pulls away communicates that his inner state is self-regulated. That doesn't mean ignoring or rejecting her feelings. It means responding without emotional urgency. When urgency disappears, attraction grows. That's why silence is often more powerful than words. Silence allows emotion to move without resistance. It gives her space to feel, reflect, and process without being guided by your reactions. In that space, her emotional awareness sharpens and she becomes more conscious of her own investment. The female mind reacts strongly to men who aren't shaken by unpredictability. Calm signals that you've already navigated emotional turbulence and survived without losing yourself. That story, even unspoken, is felt. It suggests maturity, experience, inner structure. When a woman senses she can't emotionally destabilize you, she stops testing your strength and starts trusting you. Trust isn't built through reassurance. It's built through the consistency of emotional presence. Calm creates that consistency effortlessly. That's why emotional control is one of the most powerful psychological advantages a man can develop. Not because it suppresses emotion, but because it prevents emotion from controlling him. And when emotion no longer controls you, it starts aligning with you. The fourth vulnerability is the subconscious pull of emotional distance. One of the most powerful vulnerabilities in women is their subconscious reaction to emotional distance. When it appears without hostility, without explanation, without drama. Emotional distance used unconsciously creates anxiety and disconnection, but when it appears calmly and naturally, it creates reflection, curiosity, and emotional rebalancing. This distinction is critical. Emotional distance doesn't mean coldness or rejection. It means the absence of emotional overexposure. When a man maintains emotional distance, he doesn't rush to fill every silence, clarify every misunderstanding, or reassure every mood swing. He allows emotional space to exist without panic. That space becomes psychologically loud. The female mind is highly sensitive to changes in emotional availability. When a man suddenly becomes less emotionally accessible, without changing tone, respect, or consistency, the mind searches for meaning. That search is automatic. It's not insecurity. It's the brain trying to restore emotional equilibrium. Most men, when they sense a woman pulling away, rush emotionally to close the gap. They increase effort, attention, validation, believing it will repair the connection. In reality, it collapses attraction further because it removes the very distance that creates emotional magnetism. The psychological vulnerability here lies in emotional self-reference. When emotional distance appears, a woman naturally turns inward and wonders what changed, what she might have missed, what she might need to do to restore connection. That internal shift increases emotional investment without you saying a word. Men who understand this don't use distance as punishment. They use it as alignment. They don't withdraw emotionally to provoke fear. They withdraw to reconnect with their own center. That authenticity is felt, and it makes the distance feel grounded rather than manipulative. Emotional distance also restores polarity. Attraction thrives on polarity, not similarity. When both people are emotionally fused, desire flattens. When there's space between two emotionally anchored individuals, tension reappears. That tension isn't uncomfortable, it's alive. That's why the man who can create emotional distance, without resentment, without explanation, without emotional flight, naturally regains the upper hand. He doesn't need to chase or dramatically withdraw. His stability speaks for him. The most powerful aspect of emotional distance is that it returns emotional responsibility where it belongs. When you stop managing her emotions, she starts managing hers. That shift changes everything. She becomes more present, more attentive, more aware of her role in the dynamic. A woman doesn't lose interest because a man creates space. She loses interest because a man creates need. Space without need creates intrigue. Distance without bitterness creates respect. When emotional distance is held with calm confidence, it becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, she sees her own feelings more clearly than ever. The fifth vulnerability is sensitivity to direction and leadership. One of the most underestimated vulnerabilities in women is their sensitivity to a man's sense of direction, not control or authority, but the quiet certainty of knowing where he's going emotionally, mentally, and in life. Direction creates security, and security creates attraction when it's paired with independence rather than dependence. A man without direction doesn't appear free, he appears reactive. He waits for signals, seeks approval, constantly adjusts to match the emotional environment around him. That may seem accommodating on the surface, but psychologically it communicates uncertainty. Uncertainty in a man's inner direction creates emotional instability in a woman, even if she can't explain it. Women are deeply attuned to whether a man leads his own life or simply reacts to circumstances. That awareness isn't intellectual, it's instinctive. When a man speaks, acts, and decides from inner alignment, his presence feels grounded. When that alignment is missing, his presence feels scattered. The vulnerability here is emotional anchoring. A woman subconsciously seeks emotional anchoring, not someone to depend on, but someone whose emotional state is self-directed rather than externally influenced. When she senses your moods, decisions, and confidence don't rise and fall based on her reactions, her nervous system relaxes and leans in. Many men believe leadership means controlling others. In reality, leadership in attraction begins with self-leadership. It's the ability to say no without guilt, to move forward without consensus, to hold your path without needing permission. That kind of leadership is felt immediately, because it can't be faked for long. A man with direction doesn't ask where things are going. He knows where he's headed and invites others to walk beside him if they align. That creates a psychological shift where the woman starts evaluating her place in your life rather than questioning your intentions. That reversal is subtle but powerful. Direction also creates emotional mastery. When a woman senses a man has structure within himself, she feels free to relax into her own emotions without fearing she'll destabilize him. That freedom strengthens attraction because it removes emotional pressure from the connection. Men who lack direction often overshare their plans, dreams, and intentions to compensate for insecurity. Men with direction share selectively because their confidence doesn't depend on being immediately understood. That restraint makes their vision feel more real and more solid. When a woman senses your life has momentum independent of her involvement, she feels drawn to it. Momentum is magnetic. It suggests growth, purpose, future, without needing promises or guarantees. That's why women often lose interest in men who pause their life for them. Pausing communicates stagnation. Continuing to move communicates strength. A man who advances calmly, resolutely, and without emotional hesitation activates a deep psychological response. He becomes a point of reference, not a follower. And when a woman clearly perceives that point of reference, attraction stops being a question and becomes a direction of its own. The sixth vulnerability is the need to feel emotionally earned. One of the most revealing vulnerabilities in women is the need to feel that emotional connection is earned rather than freely given. What is earned carries weight. What is given too easily feels disposable. This isn't arrogance or entitlement. It's how value is subconsciously assigned in human psychology. When emotional access is immediate and unconditional, the mind struggles to attach meaning to it. There's no contrast, no journey, no emotional investment required. Without investment, attachment weakens. That's why instant emotional availability, even when sincere, often leads to emotional disengagement over time. Women respond deeply to emotional progression. They feel most connected when each layer of intimacy unfolds naturally and requires mutual effort. When a man reveals everything too quickly, emotionally or mentally, he removes the sense of progression. The connection peaks before it has time to take root. The psychological vulnerability here lies in emotional reward systems. When a woman invests emotionally, through time, vulnerability, or effort, her mind reinforces the bond because it wants that investment to matter. That reinforcement solidifies attachment, not through dependence, but through participation. Many men sabotage this process by giving emotional intimacy before it's earned. They offer deep reassurance, constant validation, total emotional transparency too soon, believing it will accelerate closeness. In reality, it collapses the emotional ladder before it can be climbed. A man who understands this doesn't withhold emotion to control. He reveals it selectively to honor its value. He allows her to meet him emotionally step by step, creating a shared sense of building rather than emotional consumption. This approach activates pride and self-respect in the connection. A woman who feels she's earned a man's emotional depth protects it. She doesn't take it lightly. She becomes more intentional, more attentive, more invested, because the bond feels chosen rather than given. Earning emotional depth also restores balance. When both people invest gradually, neither feels overexposed or undervalued. The dynamic becomes cooperative rather than compensatory. Each person contributes to the emotional structure, making it stable. That's why men who move slowly emotionally often create longer-term attraction stronger than those who rush. Slowness allows meaning to accumulate. It allows moments to matter. It allows silence to speak. A woman doesn't want an emotionally closed man. She wants a man whose emotional depth feels real, rare, and respected. When emotion is treated as something precious rather than abundant, it becomes magnetic. Tell me in the comments, which of these psychological vulnerabilities hit you the hardest? Have you ever seen one of them play out in real life? And how did you respond once you understood it? Your story could help other men gain clarity and stop losing power without realizing it. I read everything and reply personally.